So first up today is going to be Professor Glen Westall, who has worked here at with the Lung Transplant Service for many years. He's highly regarded specialist in the area of lung transplant disease, also in the field of lung fibrosis, and is the current head of paediatric lung transplant here at the Alfred. He's well known across the country and internationally for much of his research work as well.
My remit is to talk a little bit about chronic rejection, which I've titled the kind of troll of lung transplantation, and it's the main reason lung transplants don't last as long as they do. And a lot of the research we do and a lot of the Lungitude supported research has really been focusing on this concept of chronic rejection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is, and then I'm going to talk about some of the projects that we've got running that Lungitude have allowed us to do. So many of you will be aware of this concept, is that when people get lung disease, we have to track how that disease progresses over time. And the way we do that is with lung function testing. So anyone who's had lung disease will be well aware of this concept of spirometry, where we measure your lung function. And this is what we typically see with lung disease, is that as the lung disease progresses, the lung function as measured with spirometry deteriorates. And as your lung function deteriorates, unfortunately, patients become more symptomatic. And we typically transplant people when their lung function gets down to about 30% of what it should be. We're all born with 100%. It deteriorates with lung disease. We now know that lung transplantation is an accepted therapy for patients with advanced lung disease, and certainly our own program has been going for 33 years. And of course, it's not surprising, but for those who have had a transplant or know someone who's had a transplant, we once again use lung function testing to assess the function of the transplanted lung. And this is a typical time course we see of how lung function improves with time from transplant. In fact, some research that Miranda did here actually demonstrated that people's lung function continues to improve up to 9 to 12 months post-transplant, and they don't actually peak out until about 12 months post-transplant, when they're at their strongest following the transplant operation. And the way we monitor that is with lung function testing. So as every transplant patient will know, is that that's part of the assessment we do every time you come into clinic. And when we get to that peak lung function, what we hope is that people will stay at that lung function for many years. But unfortunately, there is this concept of chronic rejection, and the way we diagnose chronic rejection is really based on what happens to their lung function over time. And this is a pattern that we see far too often. And this is the main reason we do research, is to try and stop people from developing chronic rejection. And the way we diagnose it is, again, with lung function testing. We know that at some point you'll get your maximal lung function, and we hope you'll stay there. But as it starts to deteriorate, and when it deteriorates by about 20%, we use this clinical definition of chronic rejection. And in fact, the medical term we use for that is chronic lung allograft dysfunction. So whenever we use this term CLAD, it's synonymous with this concept of chronic rejection, of an irreversible loss of lung function that occurs. And what's actually happening in the lungs, or what we see in the lungs, is that these airways, which should be widely open, become scarred and fibrotic and narrow down. And you can imagine but it's hard work breathing through something that narrow, and that's why patients get breathless as their lung function starts to deteriorate. And sadly, it's very common. We know that when we look at 5 years post-transplant, about half of anyone who's been transplanted will have developed some form of chronic lung allograft dysfunction, or CLAD. Unfortunately, when we diagnose our patients with CLAD, we have a whole series of treatments that we put in place, but sadly those treatments are pretty disappointing. It's almost as if the horse has already bolted. And whilst we try a number of things, and in some instances we can reverse this deterioration, there remains far too many patients who continue to have deteriorating lung function despite our best endeavours. So certainly as a group, as we think about this both clinically and from a research point of view, we're much more interested in prevention this rather than trying to cure it once it's occurred. And we're very much interested in this early phase post-transplant, when people seem to be improving, and seeing whether or not we can get any signals during that period that might predict that patients are going to run into problems later on. So we're very much interested in seeing if we can predict those patients who seem to be following a good trajectory, those who are going to continue to follow a good trajectory, and are they behaving differently to those who then develop clad 6 months, 12 months, or at any point later on. We want to see if there are some early markers, either clinically or scientifically, that allows us to identify these patients, because if we can identify them early, maybe we can put some interventions at this point that will stop them developing clad, noting, as I said a moment ago, that once you've got clad, our treatments are pretty disappointing. So that's very much how we've been focusing our research over the last 10 years or more, and the kind of discussions we've been having with Lungitude of the kind of research that we want supported, really trying to prevent clad rather than a focus on curing clad, if you like. And we sat down with Lungitude 2 to 3 years ago and came up with a kind of 3-year vision of 3 large projects that we wanted support for, that would allow us to try and develop some pilot data that would allow us to get substantial funding thereafter to try and improve or prevent clad. And what I'm going to do is talk about one of them. I'm just going to briefly describe the projects. One of them was around, can we better match our donors with our recipients, and seeing if that better improves long-term transplant outcomes. And I think Lucy's going to talk a little bit about that. And then the 2 other projects, one is around donor immune cells and whether or not we can harness those to prevent rejection. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And the project I'm not going to talk about today because of the interest of time is that we know that this virus called CMV, if you develop that early post-transplant, that causes clad months and years later, and we've got a number of approaches to try and minimize that, but I won't be talking about that today. So I'm going to focus on this second project about what we've been doing to try and harness donor immune cells to prevent chronic rejection. So again, by way of background, when we think about lung transplantation, we all understand the concept that we're going to take the old damaged lungs out and put in a new healthy lung, and patients will feel a lot better for it. What we've come to recognize is that despite us kind of trying to flush out any blood or any other cells within the donor lung, there are some donor blood cells that actually come over at the time that we do transplant. And we've had a major interest for 10 years or more about how these donor blood cells can impact on outcomes following lung transplantation. And we kind of summarized that in a research paper that we wrote a couple of years ago that really introduced this whole field that these donor lung cells can impact on outcomes following transplantation. And what we recognize is that they can impact them in 2 ways. There are instances where they cause trouble following transplant, but there's also instances where they're possibly favorable and may minimize rejection, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So here's a couple of instances where they can cause mischief. So we know, because we reported on this a few years ago, that one of our patients developed peanut allergy only after they'd had their lung transplant. They'd never had peanut allergy beforehand, they'd had multiple peanuts, and then they have a transplant and suddenly they get anaphylaxis. And what we went back to the donor, and it wasn't appreciated that the donor actually had peanut allergy. And these peanut allergies or anaphylaxis is driven by cells within the blood, and in particular B cells. And some of these B cells came over at the time of transplant. And for a period, until these B cells were washed out of the system, this patient had to avoid peanut allergy, and as people are, or peanuts. And as you're aware, anaphylaxis can be life-threatening. We also recognize that some of these cells can actually destroy our transplant recipients' own blood cells. It's almost as if they're at war with each other. This wasn't recognized, but something we described a few years ago, where we recognized that we had to support this patient for a number of weeks with multiple blood transfusions because these cells that had come from the donor were destroying our transplant recipients. Very rare, hadn't really been described in lung transplantation before, but again, it was our interest in these donor cells that made us realize what was going on. So there's a couple of instances where it causes trouble, but we're also interested in the concept that they can be beneficial and prevent our patients getting chronic rejection. And this is this concept of chimerism that comes from stories of Greek mythology. Here is a chimera, a mythical beast that has 2 heads, if you like, and it's this concept that our transplant patients may have someone else's cells within their body. And what had been described in liver transplantation, indeed back in the 1960s, originally by a guy called Thomas Starzl, who actually did the very first liver transplant ever in the world, he actually recognized way back then, in a story that was largely forgotten, I think, but if these donor cells hang around for a long period of time in the circulation of their liver transplant patients, those patients did better than those patients where these donor cells were washed out of the system early on. So we were interested to see whether or not that was also the case in our lung transplant patients. And I'm pleased to announce that, again, with the Lungitude support, we did this study and we were able to disseminate our research at the International Transplant meeting that was held in Denver, Colorado, earlier this year. And this is my only real data slide, but just to basically illustrate what we did is that we went back and looked at 36 of our patients. 2/3 of them had followed a stable course, had had no issues whatsoever with chronic rejection. And we compared them to another 13 patients who had run into problems after the first year, 2 years post-transplant. All of these patients had undergone bronchoscopy at multiple time points post-transplant. And what we were able to do is, with the samples that we got at bronchoscopy, with clever techniques that we're doing in the lab, using this technique called flow cytometry, we were able to identify whether cells from the donor were hanging around in the transplanted lung at 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, and over time. And we were able to compare how many donor cells were in those patients who did well compared to how many donor cells were in those patients who developed CLAD, and we were able to relate it to those two groups. And this is the money slide that came out from that study. What this graph shows is, here is the percentage of donor cells that hang around at the various time points post-transplant: 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. And there were two groups: those with the solid circles, who basically were stable and were doing well from transplant, and we were able to compare those to the open circles who developed CLAD early post-transplant. And you can see that those patients who did well had much higher levels of these donor cells at the start, but they also hung around for much longer periods of time. So in describing that, what we now need to focus on, and this is our challenge moving forward, noting that these donor cells can do bad things as well as good things, our challenge now is, how can we find a way of retaining these good cells so that we can avoid patients getting CLAD, whilst at the same time not keeping hold of the bad cells that can cause other problems following transplantation. So I will stop there. I thank you for your attention, and as ever, I thank Lungitude for their ongoing support. We are unable to do this research without Lungitude's support and all those who support Lungitude. Thank you.